Welcome to the People Dividend. And today's conversation is one that I have been looking forward to. My guest is Greg Hawkes, strategist, founder of Hawkes Agency, and the author of the book Act Like an Owner: Five Keys to Owning Your Life and Impact at Work. Greg, I'm so glad that you're here.
Mike, it is a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Hey, before we get to the framework of the
Mhm.
book, I want to start with the origin story
Yeah.
because the metaphor is at the center of your work. And it didn't come from a boardroom. It came from a house. So tell me about the house. Tell
Well,
our audience about the house.
I owned several investment properties. This is the second one I bought. I say several. I had maybe up to 10, 12 at one time. But in this season of life, I was leading a nonprofit. I was like, I better create some other income streams. And so I was starting to buy investment properties. And this one I had moved four college boys into. It was a four-bedroom, two-story, 1,900 square foot house roughly in Edmond, Oklahoma. And they just destroyed the place in a
I'm sorry.
nutshell. And it was unexpected. And because it was only the second house I had, the first one I had like a family. And so I hadn't done roommates before. And I was like, holy smokes, I didn't know people could be so destructive or so unkind or so unthoughtful. And really, I was like, these boys have vandalized the place. And honestly, none of them took responsibility. Like they all just passed the buck. And as I was leading in this nonprofit world, I had a lot of volunteers. It was around teenagers. It was mission oriented. We did these big summer camps that slept 800 kids a week and did a multiple. So we had hundreds of volunteers and people would show up and give themselves fully. And I'm like, these guys are really bought in. Like they really own this thing. And so then I have people who, and there were tenants in my homes, also not vandals, who like really acted like they owned the place. They treated it better than I did. And then some people were just using the property. They were there for a year. They were doing what renters do. They're transitioning. They're trying to figure out the next steps of life. They were in between something. And so they just needed it for that season. And then they were going to move on. And so I just recognize these owners, renters, vandals is the kinds of people that are at my work also that are, whether they're paid or volunteered, whether they're in leadership or they're young or they're however old they are, they can show up with these mindsets that really make a difference in the workplace. And so that's kind of where the whole framework came from and where the idea spawned. And then, you work with a bunch of HR professionals. That Gallup business, we just got the 2026 report out. And so, they do engaged, disengaged, and actively disengaged. And so it's like owners, renters, vandals. And so that's kind of the framework I've been working with for quite some time now.
That's amazing. So let me get this straight. I think I have it right. You had tenants who destroyed a property.
Yeah,
And
literally inside and out.
somewhere in all of that frustration, you saw a workplace.
Well, yeah, my brain works that way, Mike. I don't know how yours is. I'm a very visual. Everything to me is a metaphor. Everything I ever talk about is not just an analogy, but like the meaning within. And so, I've got messages around climbing mountains, rafting the river, camping out. I got all kinds of different metaphors as messages, running marathons. And so I don't know if you found this to be true, Mike, but I think everything in life has a lesson for us to learn. And if we can extract it, for me, extracting it and being really mindful of how I can create, memory modules that remain, the visuals help me do that. They help me capture principles. And it's usually pretty useful when I'm speaking also, that it sticks with people. And that language of owners, renters, and vandals, it really resonates with people. And I've been very fortunate to have it get embedded in company values and people's verbiage and that sort of thing.
Well, let's work with those three archetypes for our listeners who haven't thought about it or encountered it this way. You've got renters, you've got
Hmm.
vandals, and
Hmm.
you've got owners.
Hmm.
And I think most leaders assume that their people are either performing or not. It's sort of a bifurcated situation. But I think what I hear you saying is that the problem is actually more nuanced than that. Walk through those three categories,
It
Greg.
definitely is. Now, again, I shorthand things because I'm a simple person and I like people to be able to retain things. And so for me, owners bring their heart, head, and hands. They show up with passion. They show up with care. They use their imagination. They're vested in the results, whether it's their department or not. And so they kind of bring their whole selves to work, right? Renters, I say they just bring their hands. And this is where they get a bad rap, but I'm a fan of the disengaged. Like it's like, oh, the disengaged, like there's so much energy, as you know, that is put into it. But renters are literally 50 to 53% of the workforce. It's every other person in the American workforce. So they
Mhm.
are driving the economic engine of our nation. And they have just determined it's just not worth using my head and my heart. Like I'll come in on time, I'll do my job, I'll do my job well. And then when my job is done, I will go home and I will think no more about it. And I'm of the belief that that happens because the environment they're working in has kind of crushed this owner's mindset out of them and shown them we don't really want you having autonomy and agency and freedom. We just want you doing your thing. And so they're like, fine, I'll just do my thing. And then with the vandals, and Mike, this is what I find the most interesting because there is, as you know, so much energy put on let's get the disengaged engaged. How do we get our engagement numbers up? People do those surveys every year, and still, in Gallup's 25 years, there's just blips. But what moves engagement is not dealing with the disengaged, but dealing with the vandals. Taking those people that are at the bottom, they're gossipers, they're silent saboteurs, they're resistant to change. They'll quietly or loudly disregard what leadership says. Let's try this. They're the kind of people who say, I knew that was never going to work. That's never, we've done that before. And so they create this subtle resistance. And you can look at Gallup's numbers around the 2020-21, where the actively disengaged was decreased and it spiked the engaged. The disengaged stayed the same. The renters, you're going to have renters, but you want to increase your ownership, deal with this population because here's what happens, Mike, and you know this. We all come to work and we see people doing their thing and they're like, how come they get away with that? Why does leadership tolerate that? Why am I trying so hard if those got so all of a sudden they look at those who are the actively disengaged, the vandals who are kind of getting away with stuff. And they're like, well, why should I try hard? And when they see a shift in that population, people go, oh, okay. So we can start giving ourselves because it does make a difference and it does matter. And so that's what I've found. And that's kind of what the Gallup numbers show.
Well, that's so interesting. And for those who are listening and want to go back into the archives of the People Dividend, tune into the episode with Jim Harder, the chief data scientist for Gallup's employee section. And Jim and I used to do a lot of work together in the Gallup world. But I want to talk more about that renter behavior because what it sounds like from your description, Greg, is that it just often looks like compliance. A person showing up, they're hitting their numbers, their manager might think they're engaged, but what are the real tells there in terms of the behaviors that a manager might pick up on?
Well, I mean, I think, and what I've found is they just stop contributing. Like for me, the idea of contribution really equals commitment. And you see people who are bought in, even when like their ideas don't land or they're told no. And that's what happens, Mike. I mean, people show up on the first day excited and energized and they want to make a contribution and they want to give input and offer their ideas. And, I'm listening to these podcasts and I'm watching these YouTube things and I'm reading these books and I want to contribute. And kind of the environment, like the leaders are like, oh, who's the new guy? Like, chill out, buddy. We're just trying to have a meeting. And so what happens is the culture and the environment is designed to cultivate renters and it crushes the spirit of ownership out. And so I think it's a learned behavior when they show up because most people, most professionals, when they show up at work on the first day, they want to do a great job. They want to make an impression and they want to show you made a good hire. I'm going to add value. Over the course of time with frustration, disappointment, being told no, not being heard, watching the dynamics of who gets to in, input what, they just pull back and say, okay, fine. You don't like my ideas. You don't care what I say. I'll just keep them to myself. And so some of these, the tendency is then no contribution, limited contribution, and not with any sense of imagination. Now, they definitely don't care about the greater whole. Right. And in the contrast with owners, that they have kind of a whole house thinking, they're mindful of other things going on. They want to contribute in other ways. People who show up and rent, they're just like all these other departments, which I call rooms, right? Rooms in the house, all these other rooms in the house kind of feel like an annoyance to them. They're like, those guys never, and that group over there, and that location. It just, and it's like they're a bother, right? They're like, they annoy me instead of we're all trying to really make the house great. We all have a part to play. I see my place in it, and I'd like to contribute to it. So
Well,
those are just a
well,
couple. I'm sorry, you can get me going, Mike.
no, 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 and for sure, and, in the vandal, I think that one's harder for leaders to sit with because vandal behavior, or at least in my experience, I mean, thinking about this concept of vandal, isn't always loud.
No, and here's the deal. Like I'll talk about, because in general, Mike, if you had seen my home after these college boys had been in it, you would say to yourself, I will never let vandals live in my home again. And you'd be like, why would anybody let vandals even exist? But statistically, they're almost 1 in 5. And what I've found is primarily they're revenue generators. There are people who produce at high levels. And so they have a sense of isolation because they know they're producers and the company knows. And so I have empathy for leaders who are managing vandals and renters and owners because it's not just as easy to say, oh, those guys are a toxic personality. Oh, those guys aren't a team player. They're also paying for half the salary of the admin because of the relationships they have in the marketplace, because of the work they're doing. And so they have a sense of, why should I play with you guys? I'm just, so
Mm,
so again, you can have a little bit of empathy. So I found that that's the primary reason vandals exist in an organization is because it's really hard for a leader to go, if we remove them, even though they're painful for our culture, even if they impact other team members, they're such big producers for us. And so it's a risk for a leader to say, I'm going to choose culture and I'm going to choose our whole team over what's being produced. Of course, I'm of the belief that plays out in the long term. In the short term, you might feel a hit for a second, but when people see you valuing the whole, right? When leaders shift to a culture centric, healthy ownership culture kind of place, then people will rise up to that if they see that it will matter. Another reason that vandals exist is they've been there a really long time. So they've been there a long time. Nobody's dealt with these issues. Nobody's said anything. It's like, well, we haven't said anything for 10 years. And, that saying those things or acting that way, we're like, fingers crossed, we don't get a lawsuit and they'll be out of here in a year or two. And so we just kind of, everybody white knuckles it with them. And so that's another reason that vandals exist. Third one is nepotism. So
mm,
I'll give you the third one's nepotism. And I'm not saying any of the, like somebody can be in a high level producer and they're not a vandal, right? I'm not saying these
sure.
roles are that. I'm just saying the vandals tend to fall into these categories. So but that doesn't mean they are them. So nepotism, right? I work with a lot of family businesses and there's a lot of benefit to it. And there's also potential downsides where they think they're an ambassador and they're immune to, any of the rules anybody else plays by. And then the last one, Mike, you'll probably believe this. You've been in for a while. Is that they're the owner of the company. They are
Uh-huh.
like, I started this place. I was here before you were. They will say things that create division and they don't realize the damage they do to their own culture because they have an attitude of, I did this all without you before. I can do it all without, and not, and so it's usually accidental. But I have found sometimes top leadership can actually exhibit vandal behavior that creates division because that's what vandals do. They create division amongst the different teams. So I'm
Boy,
sorry I
that's
interrupted you earlier.
no, 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 that's certainly true. I mean, I think about that in my work with the founders and as companies scale and grow, there are different dynamics that develop. But you've developed 5, what you call ownership unlocks.
Yeah.
And I want to move through them, not superficially, but I
Okay.
want to
Oh, okay.
just pull out the 1 or 2 that tend to surprise leaders the most. And let's start with the first, which is risk bold commitments. I
Hmm.
think there's a word in there that most organizations have trained people to avoid: risk.
Risk. you, you, you are
Let's
right,
talk
my
a
friend.
let's talk about that, Greg.
Listen, it's I'm sure we have similar philosophies. Real growth only really is going to manifest through real risks. Like there isn't a safe way to expand our reach, our impact, our people. So even our people to grow, it's a risky business to put yourself out there. And I'll refer to just buying investment properties. Like I never bought it. I never spent money. I'd only owned 2 houses in my life prior that I lived in. And I bought a house I wasn't going to live in and somebody else was. And it was a real investment and a real risk and it was real cash. And I felt all of that. And there's no middle ground. You take the leap or you stay in safe ground. And so go on.
No. I mean, it's just making me think that real buy-in requires courage. I think that's what I'm hearing you say, just not agreement. And if you're operating in a compliance culture, I mean, you're just actively producing renters.
Right. Here's where the courage is for the leaders with the risk. So if you shift to a leadership perspective, which I like thinking like the leader, understanding the dynamics that they bear the responsibility for, it feels risky to give people agency. Right? There is a benefit to a tightened, compliance, organized work structure. And if everybody just comes in and follows along with that, at least there's a sense, which we know is not true, but there's a sense of guaranteed outcomes. Like there's not much risk if I just keep my thumb on everybody doing exactly. And so when you create this space where people have an owner's mindset and they're like, I want to try something. I see something maybe that I think could have potential and it may not. And so fashioning that kind of environment where you're like taking other people's ideas and implementing them, there's a risk to that, or giving them a little bit of leeway to go run with things. I mean, there's so many stories, of bygone era of 3M and the creative opportunities that 20% of the time they could just work on whatever. And the incredible innovation that came from that kind of philosophy, but it's also because you're paying real money and it is real time and there is literally no guarantee. And so that's a risk factor for leaders to have a sense of what they're enabling and what could possibly happen.
Well, let's talk about the second unlock then, Greg, which is activating lasting value. And you tie that, I think, to what you call free words.
Yes. Mike,
And
thanks
I'm
for looking in the book, man.
Yeah, I
We're
had
getting
to I
along.
have. What are the free words, and why do they matter more than leaders realize? Because I think it connects to psychological safety, which is a term that's been somewhat diluted, but you
Yeah.
frame it differently. So how do you think
Yeah.
about those free words?
I try to use language and think of ways. Hopefully, if we're supposed to be thought leaders, I always think, well, why don't we have a thought that at least has a little different angle to it? If we're leading, we're just not thought familiar. But this idea of free words, literally, it's my favorite, one of my favorite things about the whole book. And my natural personality is I'm an extrovert, right? I'm an encourager. So I think if I'm like, hey, you're awesome, you're great, thanks for being here, appreciate you, like it's this sense of goodness, but it's really not. The idea of activating lasting value, 3 words, is all around specificity and being able to say to somebody, hey, I noticed how this situation came up and you responded with this attitude, or hey, I noticed when that colleague came in and you just really were great about calming it. And you use specificity to articulate somebody's value. It can be in their behaviors, it can be in their attitudes, it can be in their responses to something. And you find this aspect of them that you can speak to. And what it does is it causes them to feel valued. And I say this philosophy in this book that people like people who like them.
Mhm.
So often, and I usually have to say it a couple times, is because it's like if somebody says to you, Mike, I really like you, like sincerely, genuinely, there is something in us as humans that go, dang it, I think I like you too. Like back, like it's this reciprocity. If somebody likes us, who are we going to be like, oh, yeah, you're awful. You're an awful person. No, it's like, well, if you like me, you must have good taste. You must be. So there's something in our human nature that says, if you like me, I have this thing that I almost involuntarily like you back. And with leaders, it's really not about likability, but it's about building trust. And you can't build trust with people you don't like or people that
Mm.
don't like you. And so, I encourage leaders, listen, you might have a crusty personality. You might not even be a likable person, but that's irrelevant. If you like the people you lead, and as a leader, you don't really have an option not to. I mean, I'm sure you've heard people talk badly about the people they lead and people have attitudes. And I'm like, that is the actual problem. The people, if you would say, I like you and I'm finding things about you I like, what it does is it creates a reciprocity that lets thick trust occur. And then really good things can come from that. And so for me, the activating lasting value is being really intentional. And I'm a motivational kind of guy, but I found motivation is not from the outside. And again, Mike, I'm sure you've had this experience where somebody saw something in you and said this thing in you, and they said, man, you know what I really appreciate about you? Like, I appreciate the way you handled these really difficult things with such grace and ease. And what happens to us as people is we go, I like being seen that way. I don't, I mean, I like it's nice when Greg says those things to me, but more so, I like leaning into that identity and I want to be that kind of person. And so, that's I use that framing of hooks in the soul, that when you use specific words to speak to people's potential, it puts a hook in their soul that causes that to remain because as you know, the negative sticks and the positive slips. Somebody could say something ugly to you 10 years ago and you still remember it. And that's just the nature of the soul. And so, as leaders, we're trying to find ways to put these positive things in that people retain and go, I'm going to lean into that identity, not for the pat on the back, but because that's the kind of person I want to be. And so, that's why it's a huge value. It activates this value because it makes me more valuable when I engage with you that way, and it makes you more valuable.
Well, those are great examples, Greg. And as I think about the other unlocks, the third unlock, reaching for responsibility, which you describe as responsibility as a freedom, not a burden. It's certainly different than what many might think about it. You also think about the fourth unlock, widening the circle. Silos are a problem in so many organizations. And the fifth, which is a way of synergistically thinking about everything, is think about the whole house. And I thought that that was specifically addressed to senior leaders. So if the whole house is going to stand, every room has to matter.
Yeah.
And that is really a significant accountability. In Greg's book, he talks, and I'd love you to talk a little bit about it in the time we have, Greg. You relate a story, the stove story, and truth telling about why teams stop telling the
Yeah,
truth. And I want to go there just a little bit because truth telling in organizations, I think, is one of the most underestimated leadership problems. I mean, I've often thought that,
it's interesting.
about the concept of speaking truth to power, but tell the stove story just a little
Let
bit.
me ask you this, because Mike, you're asking all the
Yeah.
questions, but you have such wisdom and such experience and you have such exposure. Like, tell me a little bit more, and I'll tell the story, but the idea of like where you see how people show up truthfully. Are you suggesting or inferring often people are, less than forthright, and that's a real damage to productivity and business as a whole because leaders don't really appreciate how guarded people are? Like, is that
Well,
what
I
you're
think what you
saying?
have to do, I think what has to happen is that you've got to make the system work. I agree with you that most people show up and they want to do a good job. There are very few that don't.
Mhm.
So it's really what exists in that system. Are there the right kind of leadership behaviors? Are there the right kind of cultural cues that people know that it's okay to bring their whole selves to work and to tell the truth? And we need more role models for that. So tell the
Yeah,
stove story,
yeah. So the
Greg.
story is I went over to their house and the dad had called me and there was an in-wall oven and the bottom burner had basically dissolved. And so he would turn it on and this flame because he called me, he said, our oven is arcing. And I'm like, what are you talking about? And so so I went over and the bottom burner had dissolved. And I said, all right, listen, I'll just buy you a new one. Like, stop turning it on. I'll get you a new one. We'll be good. And while I'm there, the mom says, hey, Greg, 3 of our 4 burners on the stovetop don't work. And I was like, "What?" Like, 'cause they had an army of children. They were a blended family. They each had maybe 3 or 4 like, there was a bunch of kids in the house, and she was domestic engineering that thing. She had literally in the living room, had, like, poster boards on the wall with names, gold stars, everybody's chores. So, like, she was running this home, and she made, I'm not joking, 2 full meals at least a day on this one burner, feeding this army of children. They had, like, this extended picnic table. I always joke, I'm like, it's not like a pottery barn. It's like from the neighborhood park. They brought this big, and they were just running children through it. And so she's doing all this. And so while I'm there, she's telling me this. And I'm, just stunned because I know, their living scenario. And I was like, absolutely. Get you a new because they'd change everything out like they'd done their duty like it was a done it'd given up the ghost and so I was like I'll get you a new one but I realized I kind of went 2 different places, Mike. One was like what is wrong with this woman? We work with people, they make decisions all the time, and you're like, how could you possibly come to this conclusion for how you should be navigating this challenge? Like, what is wrong with you? Like, who raised you? Like, where do you think at all? So we have this as leaders, this very blame oriented kind of response. It's like, I work with idiots, like literally, like you can just go there because you think that's so ridiculous. But I realized she didn't tell me because only after she saw how I responded to her husband because she was afraid that if she had said, Greg, our stovetop's not working, I could have responded in a way that was like, why did you break my stove? You have to pay for it now. If you don't pay for it now, you have to move out of my house. So she didn't know how I would respond. And she didn't know the level of willingness I'd have to work with her on it. And so what I realized was people go to great lengths to avoid emotionally unsafe situations. Even if I'm safe, because I'm like, I'm a great landlord. Are you kidding me? I'll just buy a new one like that. But she didn't know that. She hadn't spent enough time with me. She didn't really understand kind of my philosophy about how I was landlording. And so she, probably her past experiences with other landlords, she was just fearful. And so she was going way out of her way than just having an honest conversation with me and being candid about what was taking place.
Boy, and I think that's one thing that comes through in your book. It's about paying attention to the signals and how do you curate those signals. And it's really about the return on investment that leaders can make it with kindness and
Hmm.
specificity really do connect to what you describe in terms of retention and performance. And I think the way that you frame it is that it's not a soft argument, but it's really a business case.
Yeah. Oh, it's a competitive advantage. You know that. You know that creating a space where people can show up and they have the freedom to bring their full selves and have the trust to take some courageous steps. I mean, it makes a difference.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's one of the things that, I wrote about in The People Dividend, my last book about
Hmm.
the gap between what leaders intend and what people actually experience.
Yeah.
And for me, that's about how do we turn, high performers sometimes in the other direction and we turn them into renters
Hmm.
rather than owners. And it really does require some very specific leadership behaviors. So, Greg, the book is Act Like an Owner. Where can people find you and follow the work?
All right. Well, easy enough. Just my first name, last name.com. Greg Hawkes, GREGHAWKS.com is the website. Of course, the book is there, but it just leads you to Amazon. You can get it at Barnes and Noble, all those things online. The audiobook, I read it. Mike, I had this whole narrator voice come over. I was reading it this way. That was so I love the audiobook. So if people are Audible listeners, it's there. And it's really my favorite version of the book. And so Kindle version, that sort of thing. And so we have a company leadership edition that we've made, and there's all kinds. So Amazon is the place, online is the place, and greghawks.com. And of course, LinkedIn. I love connecting with people on LinkedIn.
That's great. I really appreciate the clarity of the thinking and particularly the fact that it's grounded in, a very real experience that you had. So, Greg, thank you so much for being on the People Dividend.
Totally my pleasure, Mike. Thank you.
Well, everyone, that's it for today. If this landed for you, share it with a leader who needs it. And we'll see you the next time. And until then, stay well.